I was standing in the back of my brother-in-law's promotion ceremony when he looked straight at me and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, that some people in the family wouldn't last a single day in real service, and then he smiled like it was a joke, and people actually laughed. Even my own husband didn't say a word. He just sat there and let it happen. And in that moment I realized I wasn't just being ignored, I was being erased right in front of everyone who was supposed to be my family, and I stood there, hands still, heart steady, choosing silence over reaction. But that silence wasn't weakness, it was timing. And if you've ever been in a moment like that, where you felt small in a room full of people, then take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time, only if this story truly resonates with you. Because what happened next changed everything. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 42 years old, and that night, at a military promotion ceremony in Arlington, was the moment my husband's family learned who I really was. But to understand how it got to that point, you need to go back a few hours earlier, to the moment I decided whether or not to wear my uniform. I stood in front of my closet for almost 10 minutes, just staring at my uniform hanging there, pressed, clean, every line sharp, every insignia in place, and for a second I reached out to take it down, my fingers brushing the fabric, but then I stopped, because I could already hear my mother-in-law's voice in my head telling me this was not my event, that tonight was about Michael, not me, and I let my hand drop, choosing instead a simple navy dress. Something quiet, something that would not draw attention, something that would let me exist in the background the way they all seemed to prefer. And even as I got ready, I told myself it did not matter, that it was just one night, just a ceremony, just another moment where I would keep the peace. But deep down, something felt off, like I was stepping into a room where I already knew how it would end. When Daniel walked in and saw me, he paused for a second, not in admiration, not even in surprise, just a quick glance before he said, "You might want to stay in the back tonight. It is more formal up front," his tone calm, almost casual, like he was giving helpful advice, but the words settled heavy in my chest. I nodded anyway, because arguing would only make things worse. And that was how it always worked with his family. Small comments, quiet directions, nothing loud enough to call out, but enough to remind me where I stood. We drove to the venue in silence, the city lights passing by the window, Arlington looking polished and distant, like a place where everything had order and structure, unlike the tension sitting between us. When we arrived, the building was already filled with people, uniforms, medals, conversations flowing easily between those who belonged. And I felt it immediately, that invisible line between them and me. Daniel walked ahead, greeting people, shaking hands, slipping into that world like it was built for him, while I followed a few steps behind, unnoticed, unintroduced, just there, near the entrance, holding my small clutch like it gave me purpose. His mother spotted me first, her eyes scanning me from head to toe, not in curiosity, but in quiet evaluation. And then she smiled, polite but tight. "You made it," she said, before leaning in slightly, her voice lowering just enough that only I could hear. "You should stay toward the back, sweetheart. This section is reserved for immediate family and officers." I felt the words more than I heard them, like a door closing gently but firmly. I nodded again, stepping aside without a word, watching as she turned her attention back to the front, where Michael stood surrounded by people congratulating him. His uniform perfect, his posture confident, everything about him commanding respect. And for a moment I just stood there, taking it in, the room, the lights, the way people moved, the way they spoke. And I noticed something small but sharp. Not one person asked who I was, not one introduction, not one acknowledgement, as if I had already been placed into a category that did not require explanation. Just the wife, just someone attached, not someone who mattered on her own. I found a seat in the last row, quiet, out of the way, and sat down, folding my hands in my lap, watching as the ceremony began, the speeches, the applause, the pride in the room building with every word. And then Michael stepped forward, adjusting the microphone, his voice steady, confident, thanking his mentors, his colleagues, his family, and for a moment it felt normal, expected, until his tone shifted just slightly, just enough to catch attention, and he glanced toward the back of the room, toward me, before saying something that made a few people chuckle, and I felt it instantly, that familiar tightening in my chest, that quiet signal that something was about to go wrong. But I stayed still, because by then, I had already made my choice not to wear the uniform, not to step forward, not to interrupt, and now all I could do was sit there and wait, knowing that whatever happened next, it was already in motion. Michael adjusted the microphone slightly and smiled as the room settled into silence, his voice steady at first, thanking the usual names, mentors, colleagues, the people who had supported his career, and everything felt expected, predictable, until he paused for just a second, like he was about to say something more personal, and then he said it, that some people like to stand near greatness without ever understanding what it takes to earn it, and a few people laughed softly, not loud enough to be called out, but enough to be heard. And then he glanced toward the back again, not directly pointing, but close enough that heads began to turn, and I could feel the shift instantly, eyes landing on me one by one, quiet, curious, judging, and still I did not move. I did not look up. I kept my hands folded, my posture calm, because reacting would only give them what they wanted, and I had learned that lesson a long time ago, that sometimes silence holds more control than words, but inside, something tightened, not anger, not even embarrassment, just a quiet awareness that the line had been crossed again, only this time it was in front of everyone. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, not enough to stand, not enough to speak, just a small movement that told me he heard it too, and chose to stay still, and that choice said more than anything he could have said out loud. Michael continued, his tone confident, building on the moment, talking about sacrifice, about long nights, about discipline, and then he added that not everyone is built for this kind of life, that some people prefer comfort, prefer watching from the sidelines, and this time the laughter was a little louder, a little more certain, and I could hear my mother-in-law somewhere in the front row, a soft chuckle, quick, almost hidden, but not enough to escape notice, and for a brief second, my fingers pressed slightly into my palm, just enough to feel the pressure, grounding myself, reminding myself to stay exactly where I was, because this was not new. This was just the first time it had a stage, the first time it had an audience, and the first time it had a microphone amplifying it. I lifted my eyes just slightly, not enough to meet anyone's gaze, but enough to take in the room, the rows of uniforms, the polished shoes, the medals catching the light, the expressions shifting from polite interest to quiet amusement, and then something else, something smaller, harder to define, a hesitation, as if a few people were trying to understand why his words felt directed, why there was a target in a speech that was supposed to be about honor, and I noticed it in one particular man seated near the front, an older officer, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He was not laughing, he was watching, not Michael, but the room, scanning, measuring, and for a second his gaze moved toward the back, toward me, and stayed there just a fraction longer than normal, like he was trying to place something, a memory, a detail that did not quite fit. I looked away before our eyes could fully meet, not out of fear, but because I did not need that moment yet. Not yet. Michael finished his speech with confidence. The applause came quickly, strong, filling the room, people standing, clapping, celebrating him, and I joined in, just like everyone else, my hands moving in rhythm, my expression calm, controlled, as if nothing had happened, as if I had not just been reduced to a quiet example in his story. But as the applause began to fade, something unexpected happened. The man in the front row stood up, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and he stepped toward the stage, speaking quietly to the event coordinator, who nodded almost immediately, and then turned toward the microphone, adjusting it slightly, and the room, still settling from applause, began to quiet again, not fully, but enough that people started to notice the change. Conversations paused, heads turned, and there was a small shift in the air, subtle but real, the kind of shift that happens right before something important is about to be said, and I felt it too, not as surprise, but as recognition, like a door I had not planned to open was now slowly being pushed ajar, and I remained where I was, still in the last row, still in the same simple dress, still looking like I did not belong, even as the entire room unknowingly stood on the edge of finding out exactly who I was. The officer did not rush. He walked with a calm that carried weight, the kind of presence that made people move without being told. And when he reached the microphone, he did not smile. He simply adjusted it slightly and looked out across the room, letting the silence settle fully before he spoke. And his voice was steady, controlled, not loud, but clear enough that every word landed. He said that before the evening continued, there was someone in attendance who had not been properly acknowledged, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle at first. A few heads turning, a few whispers starting and then stopping just as quickly, as if people were unsure whether they should react yet. Michael stepped back slightly, his expression tightening for just a second, confusion flickering across his face, because this was not part of the program. This was not something he had planned, and I stayed exactly where I was, still seated in the last row, my hands resting in my lap, my posture unchanged, because I already understood what was happening. Even before the name was spoken, the officer glanced down briefly, not at a paper, not at a script, but as if confirming something he already knew. And then he looked up again, scanning the room slowly, deliberately, his eyes passing over rows of uniforms, families, guests, until they reached the back, until they found me. And this time I did not look away. I held his gaze, steady, quiet, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade. The conversations, the movement, the small sounds of the room settling, all of it narrowing down to that single point of recognition. He gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and then he spoke again, asking for everyone's attention, his tone shifting just enough to signal that this mattered, that this was not a formality, that this was something else entirely. The room grew quieter, chairs stilled, people leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what was happening. My mother-in-law turned in her seat, her brows pulling together in confusion. Daniel straightened just a little, his eyes moving toward the stage, then toward the back, then back again, like he was trying to connect something that did not quite make sense yet. And Michael, standing just off to the side, kept his expression composed, but his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening in a way that only someone watching closely would notice. The officer paused again, just long enough to stretch the moment, just long enough for the tension to build, and then he said my name, not rushed, not dramatic, just clear, Rachel Carter, and for a split second, nothing happened. No reaction, no movement, just a brief suspension, like the room needed time to process what it had just heard. And then he added the one detail that changed everything: Colonel Rachel Carter, United States Army. And it was not loud, it did not need to be, because the impact did not come from volume, it came from certainty, from authority, from the fact that it was being said by someone who did not need to prove anything. And the silence that followed was different from before. It was heavier, sharper, no laughter, no whispers, just stillness. I could feel it ripple outward, row by row, person by person. As the meaning settled in, as the pieces began to rearrange themselves in everyone's mind, I stood slowly, not hurried, not hesitant, just a single controlled movement. And as I did, I could see it, the shift in faces, confusion turning into realization. Realization turning into something else, something closer to shock. My mother-in-law's lips parted slightly, her posture changing, her earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty. Daniel's eyes fixed on me, not with anger, not even with embarrassment, but with something quieter, something heavier, like he was seeing me for the first time. And Michael, still near the stage, did not move at all, his expression frozen in place, the certainty he carried just moments ago now, replaced with something far less stable. And I took my first step forward, moving down the aisle, the sound of my heels soft against the floor, each step measured, each step deliberate, not to make a statement, not to prove anything, but simply because it was my turn to be seen, and no one in that room was ready for what that meant. I walked forward without rushing, each step steady, measured, the sound of my heels soft but somehow louder than anything else in that room, and no one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the entire space had been paused, waiting for something they did not yet understand. And as I passed the rows of seats, I could feel it, the shift in attention, people leaning slightly, watching more carefully now, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition forming in real time. And I did not look at them. I did not need to, because I could already feel what was happening, the recalculation, the quiet adjustment of everything they thought they knew about me. When I reached the front, the officer stepped aside, just enough to give me space. Not as a gesture of courtesy, but as acknowledgement, and that difference mattered. I gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just enough to confirm what had already been said, and I turned slightly toward the room, my posture straight, my expression calm, not cold, not proud, just controlled, because this was not about proving anything. It never was. It was simply about truth, and for a moment, no one knew what to do. The program had been interrupted, the script broken, and without that structure, people hesitated, unsure how to respond, until the officer spoke again, briefly, formally, recognizing my service, my rank, my years, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, not because of what was said, but because of who was saying it. And as he finished, a few people in the front began to clap, tentative at first, then stronger, spreading outward row by row, until the entire room followed, the applause building, not loud in celebration, but firm in acknowledgement, and I stood there, receiving it quietly, not smiling, not reacting beyond a slight incline of my head, because this was not new to me, but for them, it was everything. I turned slightly then, just enough to see the faces that had been so certain before. My mother-in-law no longer held that composed smile, her lips pressed together, her eyes shifting as if searching for something to say that would make sense of this. Daniel still had not moved, his gaze fixed on me, but now there was no distance in it, no dismissal, just something heavier, something closer to realization. And Michael, standing just a few feet away, looked different entirely. The confidence that had filled his speech now replaced with a stillness that felt unfamiliar on him. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his expression no longer controlled, and for a brief second, our eyes met, and he looked away first, not dramatically, just a small movement, but enough to show that something had shifted, that the balance he had assumed was no longer where he thought it was. And I did not say anything to him. I did not need to, because the moment itself had already said more than words ever could. I stepped back slightly, giving space for the ceremony to continue, because I was not there to take anything from him, not his moment, not his recognition. I was only there because I had always been there. Even when they chose not to see it, the officer returned to the microphone. The program resumed, but it was different now. Every word, every movement carried a new awareness. Conversations were quieter, more careful, and I walked back down the aisle, returning to my seat in the last row, the same place I had been before, but nothing about it felt the same. And as I sat down, folding my hands once more in my lap, I could feel the weight of their attention still lingering, not loud, not obvious, but present. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small breath, slow, steady, because the hardest part was not standing up there. It was everything that would come after, everything they would try to say, everything they would try to fix. And I already knew, as clearly as I had known not to wear the uniform, that the real conversation had not even begun yet. In the weeks after that night, nothing changed overnight, but everything felt different in a way that was impossible to ignore. The silence in that room did not stay there. It followed us home, into conversations that used to be easy, and into moments that used to pass without meaning. Daniel spoke less at first, not because he did not have words, but because he was finally listening, really listening, not to what I said, but to what I had never said. My mother-in-law became more careful, her tone softer, her eyes searching for something she had missed all along. And Michael, he never brought up that speech again, not once, because some things do not need to be corrected out loud, they correct themselves in the quiet. And as for me, I did not suddenly become louder or more demanding. I did not need to, because the shift was not about them finally seeing me. It was about me no longer needing them to. I kept my routines the same, my work steady, my life structured the way it always had been, but there was a clarity now, a line that I could feel, not drawn in anger, but in understanding. I stopped explaining myself where I was not being heard. I stopped shrinking in spaces where I had already earned my place. And most importantly, I stopped waiting for permission to exist as I am, because that night did not give me value. It revealed it, and there is a difference between the two. One can be taken away, the other cannot. What I learned is simple, but it takes time to truly understand. People will treat you based on what they think you are, not what you actually are. And if you spend your life trying to correct every assumption, you will lose yourself in the process. But if you stay grounded in your truth, in your work, in your integrity, eventually the right moment will come, not to prove them wrong, but to remind yourself that you were never small to begin with. And if you are listening to this right now, feeling overlooked, underestimated, or quietly pushed to the side, I want you to know something. You do not have to fight every battle. You do not have to raise your voice in every room. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is hold your ground, trust your timing, and let your life speak. When the moment is right, protect your peace the same way you protect your future. Protect your finances, your independence, your emotional boundaries, because those are the things that no one should ever have control over except you. And trust that inner voice, that quiet instinct that tells you when something feels off. That is not weakness, that is guidance. Some people call it intuition. Some call it faith. Some call it God. But whatever you call it, it is there to keep you aligned with who you truly are, not who others expect you to be. Healing does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself in small, consistent ways, day after day, until one day you realize you are no longer asking for acceptance. You are living in self-respect, and that changes everything. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly, because sharing something like this is not about reliving the past. It is about connecting with someone out there who might need to hear that they are not alone, that they are not invisible, that their worth does not depend on recognition. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear where you are listening from, what time it is for you right now, and what part of this resonated with your own life. And if you feel it in your heart, you can share this or subscribe so we can continue these conversations together. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 42 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let anyone else define your value.